It is so great to have you here for this Bible study. And it's so great to have, and it's Ira. I'm glad you're here. We're also doing this Bible study for people through YouTube and to be able to watch that and study along with us. And of course, our Bible study is the book of Exodus. Exodus is actually my favorite book of the Bible. I love it because it really highlights transformation. You see the transformation of the character of Moses from this man who is a murderer. He ran away. He doubted. He had some hardships on leading his people. And ultimately, he becomes the person that stands on Mount Sinai and receives the Ten Commandments and even convinces God to keep the covenant with Israel, which we'll talk about at a later Bible study. So his transformation and the transformation of the people of Israel to being a people that are oppressed, to a people that are free. And what an exciting thing that is for us. The book of Exodus primarily highlights four major themes throughout the book. Liberation, law, covenant, and presence. And those are brought about in that there's the liberation of the Israelite people from Egyptian oppression, the receiving of the Ten Commandments and the laws, the establishment and renewal of the covenant between God and Israel, and then the wisdom and knowledge of the presence of God among God's people. So when we look at the book of Exodus, the last recording of the final writing, the writing down of this text, is roughly the 500s. It's the 6th century before Christ. And at that time that it's written, it's either during the exile period where Israel is under oppression, or right after the exile period where they're recovering from oppression of the Babylonian Empire. And that informs the writing of this book. And it's interesting that they're writing about the freedom of the Israelites from the Egyptians out of oppression. And here they are also struggling with oppression themselves in their modern era. And that plays into the writing as they connect with God to put pen to paper the events that have been shared through oral history. What are the things that you think about when you think of the book of Exodus? Uh-huh. Right. Uh-huh. Yes. Right, right. And we'll be talking about their journey through the wilderness, and I think, some of the iconic events are, of course, the baby Moses in the basket, and the burning bush, and the 10 plagues, and the crossing the Red Sea, the 10 Commandments. There's so much in this book to unpack, and we're going to do the best job we can of exploring all those things, including how this text of Exodus plays an important role in the rest of the Old Testament and then informs the New Testament. So let's begin by reading Exodus. Would you be willing to read verses 1 through 7?
These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly, and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them.
Thank you so much. Here, these selection of verses serve an important purpose, just as any introduction does. They're building a connection to the previous book in the Pentateuch, Genesis. Genesis obviously starts the story of God's interaction with the Israelites, beginning with Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob and his children, who are the 12 tribes of Israel. And we see here that they've had to kind of fast forward the understanding of how the people of Israel have come about. When we last left, there were just a handful with a big old family. And here we understand that they've passed away, and generation has come, and they're fruitful, they're prolific. So we're going to see this emphasized, that the people of Israel are numerous in number. And we see that they're exceedingly strong, and the land was filled with them. And I'll go ahead and read the next few verses. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. So we see the king in Egypt, the Pharaoh. He's displeased because the Israelite people keep growing and growing and growing, and he sees them as a threat, if not now, down the road. And his choice is to basically brutalize them, give them forced labor, and continue to kind of put the hammer down upon these people. And it works against him in that they just continue to multiply, and the people are so numerous, it looks as though that maybe their numbers rival Egypt. We're not sure. But what we do know is that there's this ruthless nature of imposing tasks upon the Israelites from Egypt. Any thoughts or questions about that? No? And here we'll read through the end of the chapter. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the bar stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born of the Hebrews, you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. So we see here the midwives are asked by the Pharaoh to get rid of all of the male children. And of course, in this selection of verses, we actually see these midwives outwit and maneuver around what the Pharaoh is asking. It's kind of sick how he has asked them to do the exact opposite of what their job is. Their job is to help bring forth life, and he's asking, or not asking, he's commanding them to kill all the male children. And so when we think about that, that kind of alarms us. But we can see that there's some humor within this verse that follows. Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So here they are speaking to Pharaoh, them being Hebrew women tasked with this, and basically they kind of are joking about Egyptian women. They're putting them down in one sentence, and then the next they're pumping up the Hebrew women. It's a wonderful display there, and of course it goes right over Pharaoh's head. He doesn't understand, and he doesn't get that the midwives are basically acting against him. Now, one of the interesting things is that you see there's two women that are named as the midwives, and obviously they keep saying there's numerous people, and there's keep adding to their families and all this, and so it doesn't make much sense that these are the only two midwives. I mean, there would have to be a whole lot more. So some people have thought that these two women represent different kinds of groups of midwives that are working together to not follow what the Pharaoh is asking. You'll also note that the Pharaoh, in an instant with the midwives, and then of course he asks his own people to throw the Hebrew boys into the river. Both of those circumstances, he's having other people do the killing. He himself is not going out there and throwing them in. He's commanding all these others to do these things. So he's kind of wiping his hands of this task. What do you think about this wild?
It's really time. Things don't change through the generations to present. We have evil people that have other people do the dirty job while they sit back.
Right. That's so true. Can you think of a place in the New Testament that this mirrors, that this connects with? The killing of the children. The children. That's right. That's exactly right. The writer of Matthew is very much connected to the book of Exodus and connects the journey of Moses also with the journey of Jesus. And we see Herod, very much like Pharaoh, wanting to get this threat away by having all the children 2 years and under killed. And so these two events align, and in both instances, those leaders fail, and the heroes of each story are able to be freed and get out of there. So, the other aspect of this is that the irony is that you kind of heard it repeated that he wants the boys killed, but not the girls. And it's the women so far that have done the talented and creative work of trying to be tricky and cunning to prevent these deaths. And so it's kind of interesting that the gender that he hasn't chosen is the one that's so actively helpful and not letting the wishes be carried out.
Well, there was no fear of the women because they were worthless.
That's right. And so he definitely underestimated them, right?
It was okay for them to live.
Right. So let's continue on. Would you like to read verses 1 through 4 of chapter 2? 1 through 4.
Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him.
Very good. Thank you so much. We see there right away another fast forward kind of event that takes place. So in the first verse, well, there's a man and a woman, they get together. In the next verse, they have a kid. You know, all these things are happening very fast, and all of a sudden this kid's 3 months old. And the miraculous ability for this woman to hide a 3-month-old, that's not hard. That's not easy to do. And perhaps there's just a little bit of creative ways that they've kind of not let the cries of the baby get out. But what's a certainty for the mother is that there is a timetable in which hiding becomes even more impossible as the baby crawls, as the baby walks, as the baby gets taller, as the baby runs, and so she knows there has to be a way to figure out some kind of relief. We see there what she makes. She makes this basket, places the child in it, and is placed among the reeds on the bank of the river. And this is interesting because oftentimes people see that the Red Sea, where they part, the words are actually supposed to be translated to the Sea of Reeds, or the Reed Sea. And so that's significant in that she places him among the reeds in the bank, because it's foretelling of when he will lead the people of Israel through the water on the Reed Sea. So he's kind of escaped in this sense of his death, even though there's still anxiety and uncertainty. So there's kind of a foreshadowing that this is going to happen, the freedom's going to come. And his sister stood at a distance. What do you think about keeping a baby quiet for 3 months? And that seems pretty hard to do. Absolutely. And that's the frightening thing is She must feel that this is the only way of some kind of chance of the baby surviving. Let's read on. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." It's kind of an incredible story that continues here. And some folks take this in different directions. Some people think it's by chance that the mother placed Moses in the water and the Pharaoh's daughter just happened to find. Others might say this was strategic, that the mother of Moses knew that Pharaoh's daughter was nearby, or that eventually she would see the baby. Now, we don't know. That there seems to be some kind of connection with Moses' sister and Pharaoh's daughter. We don't know if they've met before. I mean, it just seems like they have. And so it seems like this is kind of a way in which the mother and the sister are both kind of working to save Moses. Maybe they know that Pharaoh's daughter is different from Pharaoh and that she has a lot more compassion, or maybe they just know that maybe the women at this time are horrified at even the Egyptian women are horrified at what they're doing to all these women's children. So it's kind of an interesting connect the dots here. We see the mother of Moses place the baby in the basket. We see the sister of Moses watch over him. We see Pharaoh's daughter find the baby, and she connects with Moses' sister and has her go and find a woman to nurse. Of course, she goes to her own mother, and Moses' mother gets to nurse Moses. And she gets to be paid also, which isn't a bad deal. And the child grows up, and seemingly, kind of Pharaoh's daughter and Moses' mother are kind of raising Moses. But it seems like most of his life is spent at the palace, or at the place where Pharaoh's daughter is. That makes sense? Does that make sense? All these little points. Right. Yeah. That's right. I think it's important that it's not just a random, all right, good luck. These so far, 5 women have helped to save Moses. The 2 midwives, Moses' mother and sister, and now Pharaoh's daughter. And again, we go back to the point of the underestimating of the women by Pharaoh and their ability to help save Moses, and we hope also other children. Any questions about that? Okay. Would you mind reading chapter 2, verse 11 through 14?
One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known."
Thank you. So we went from Moses being a very young child basically to an adult. So we don't know what has happened in that time span. Now there are all kinds of movies out there that have tried to fill in that story. Some of them are pretty hard to watch. Some are okay. But truly, we don't know. But we can imagine that Moses probably feels in a very strange position, because seemingly he's kind of raised Egyptian and Israelite. So you almost could say he doesn't feel belonged to either of them. He feels maybe trapped by that. And in this sense, he may even feel like he's a foreigner in his own land. He's raised by Pharaoh's daughter, who's Egyptian, but he himself is Israelite. And I'm sure that he's seen a time or two before this abuses against the Hebrew people. And he must know he's Hebrew. I'm sure, we can assume that his mother at some point says, "Hey, look, this is what happened to you." And so you can maybe see the outrage that Moses feels trapped, like, I'm witnessing these horrors, but I can't do anything. And of course, he snaps. And as he snaps, he then gets worried. Following that, he doesn't immediately feel remorse. He kind of feels the remorse after he knows that everybody kind of knows. If a couple Hebrews know, I guess that means all of them know. And it saddens me, maybe it does you too, that he feels like he just has to run away. And maybe it's because of that dual identity. He just doesn't know what to do, and so he flees and runs away. Any speculation about that? Yeah. Right. That's true. Yeah, the consequences of what were to happen. Because the next verse, we see that the Pharaoh sought to kill Moses. So that reinforces that even more. Let me read the next few verses again. Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he settled in the land of Midian, sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. When they returned to their father, Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread. Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he bore a son. Stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. So this is another kind of fast-forward event here. We see Moses come across Midianites, which is, I believe, east of Egypt. And this priest has 7 daughters, and he helps them. And basically, Reuel, who becomes his father-in-law, and there are 2 other names for Reuel that get tossed around in the Bible. Jethro and Hobab are also names for Moses, his father-in-law. And it seems like, as a token for being honorable in this way, of helping them, basically he gives his daughter Zipporah to him in marriage. And so we're seeing here that time is passing by, because they have a son, he's named, and it seems like they're settling down all together. That Gershom name, I think a lot of people might be hard-pressed to remember that Moses had a kid, or he was even married. Those are some of the parts of the story that are often neglected or forgotten, or because there's not a lot of verses about them or stories about them, they just kind of get skipped over. But I have been an alien residing in a foreign land, and that's a true statement for that moment in time. But I think that's a true statement for his whole life, that he's never really understood where his home is, and coincidentally, he's going to help the people of Israel find their home. Any thoughts or questions about that story? These last few verses are very important. This starts at verse 23. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. This is an essential transition part of the story. Basically, up until this point, the name of God has just been used haphazardly or only as a reference. There's no story involving God and someone else. All that we have really understood is what is currently happening to the Israelites and the birth and growing up of Moses and where Moses is now. Up until that point, God hasn't entered the story. And this is the moment in which we're going to do a sharp turn. And, okay, here's God that's now going to come and work through Moses and accomplish this task of freeing his people. There are a few things that happen in this short transition piece. One, it explains the current king who began the oppression is dead. So it also implies that oppression is continuing. The suffering of the Israelites is continuing, and they are so oppressed that they cry out to God. So it's almost like they're pausing here and letting you get a viewpoint from God's perspective of all this groaning, kind of in unison of what their oppression is. And then the third is that God hears their cries and is going to bring about their freedom. And one of the interesting things that may trip people up is that it almost implies that God has not been listening, that God has been almost withdrawn. And, people can read it that way. It can also be read in the idea that God has allowed these certain events to happen to get to this stage that's kind of a perfect moment to then create the situation for freedom. God kind of knows the right time to step in where things are going to work, or at least be able to come about. But Walter Brueggemann is an Old Testament scholar, probably one of the best of the last 100 years. And he said that there are 4 verbs that is associated with God in these last verses. God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew. What's that?
Action.
Yes, action, right? Action verbs. And that tells us and leads us to the understanding that there's now going to be action. And all of those play into kind of building up to this moment where now God is going to meet Moses in the next chapter. And so what we can individually reflect upon in order to connect, and may not be at all in a similar way, but when is a time that you have cried out to God? We can kind of think about that moment. When have we cried out to God where we feel the weight of the world on our shoulders? And when is a time where you felt God heard you? Those are questions for us to ponder and pray about. And when we come up with answers of times when we've felt God hear us, that can help to strengthen our faith by being able to know for sure that what God did so long ago in hearing Israel, and when God, I think it could also be said that once God hears something, God is going to act. So, I think something that I meant to say a little bit earlier is that we've noticed throughout that the people of Israel are increasing in number. And it says that they're also increasing in strength. And it seems like we're building to this moment at the end of chapter 2 that says there's now so many. This is truly a nation of Israel beneath all of this oppression. And now their strength is maybe fading because the oppression is so difficult. And now it seems like God is looking upon them in mercy and says, well, let's remember this covenant and let's make something special. So let us close with a word of prayer. God, we just give you thanks for the blessing of this day and our time together. We ask that you would strengthen us by your Spirit. Help us to hear you, to see you, to remember you, to know you. And as that settles in our hearts and minds, we pray it empowers us to live lives that bring joy and peace. Amen.